Tim Swanson is a person I've known for about 5.5 years, I guess. We first met in Tokyo when he was working at R3. And since then, he's had many different fascinating projects that he's worked on. And he's still very popular and I guess very interesting speaker. He has a blog called The Great Chain of Numbers, is that it? Of Numbers. And he's on crypto Twitter, of course, writing amazing tweets every day. So Tim is working now at Clearmatics, but I'm sure he can introduce himself a little bit. Today he's going to talk about DeFi's dependency on the US banking system. So take it away, Tim.
Yeah, thanks for the kind intro. And yeah, it's been a while since we actually had a chance to meet. I guess at the economy a couple of years ago, but hopefully with the post-COVID world, we'll have a chance to meet up and talk about these ideas face to face with all your listeners. So thanks for having me. And yeah, as Makoto said, I've had a chance to move in and out of some really interesting circles of bright people, primarily on the central bank digital currency side. I know the previous speaker talked about their organization of spearheading it. That's a little bit different history than I recall, and I'm not going to sit here and argue about who did what when. But I will say that the current employer I work at, Clearmatics, they launched the first consortia around CBDC effectively in September 2015. That was the first official bank involved in that was UBS, and it grew to about a dozen, and then they spun it off to be its own company called Finality, which is now still working in that vein. So if listeners are interested in the CBDC, CBDA discussions, happy to talk about that in QA or offline. But this particular conversation or this topic is probably more closer to home because it's not institutional based per se. There's a lot of retail activity in the DeFi world. So without further ado, let me jump into the slides. And just quick disclaimer, obviously I'm not here to represent, or the views here are not necessarily representing everyone at Clearmatics or other organizations or projects I work with. And I am not a lawyer, so feel free to get legal advice from somebody that can bill you. Although I'm happy to bill you, I'm just not a lawyer. So narrative violations. Makoto, you and I have seen this for years, this idea of hyper-Bitcoinization, which is just some gimmicky marketing term by a bunch of Bitcoin bag holders from 2013, 2014. And they've done a great job marketing it in the sense that, it's become a term of art. You hear it even on TV. But it's not based on any actual facts. If anything, we have the opposite happening, rapid dollarization taking place because of stable coins. And again, we'll go into definitions in a second here, but if you just look at the aggregate value or supposed value, paper value, as it were, of these stable coins, they're about 10% of the market cap, as it were, of cryptocurrencies. And there's all sorts of caveats there. But that started from zero in 2014 and has grown to now 10%. And the bulk of that growth has happened in the last 7 months or so. Not saying it will forever go in that disco stew, hockey chart. But the idea here is this is what Rohan Gray has pointed out. The promoters and meme artisans, as it were, often claim they're going to go to the moon or stars, but really in practice, what they're doing is they're just drilling down further into the foundations of the earth by what they actually do in practice, which is using the U.S. banking system or other traditional financial systems to for a unit of account or for liquidity. And we can see here's one visual of this. This is a chart, about a 1 year chart. You can see 5 specific stablecoins and the breakdown. We're not going to go into all of them, but it hovers around $105 billion, $110 billion. This is on paper. We're not 100% sure of how much these are actually backed by dollar-related assets. And there's been a lot of controversy, for example, with Tether. At one point, they had, I think it was 74% backing. And were sued by the New York Attorney General. That was discovered during the lawsuit with them over the last couple of years. So putting that aside for the moment, I'm going to use the term stablecoin as basically a no coin. I should just call it stable, and it's not really stable, so it's neither. But putting aside all the little pokes and prods and shade I get through at this, the term coin is really misleading because these are really just under or unregulated bank deposits. And what I mean by that is if you go use a checking account at a bank, there's certain things you're allowed to do. It's a permission-based system, and there's terms of service, and you get kicked out, stuff like that. And so what these effectively these stable coins do is they take the utility of a checking account, and then they use regulatory arbitrage to not comply with whatever jurisdiction they're supposed to be involved in. So that's a lot of shade, and I'll back it up with some actual numbers and stuff like that. But before I do that, I'm sure I'm going to sound like a broken record to anyone who's actually had a chance to speak to me on this topic. PFMIs, the principles for financial market infrastructure, is a concept, is a set of principles that's been evolving for over just about a decade now. It sprung forth. Well, actually, the general idea goes back over 2 decades, but this document that most people cite from 2012 came about because of the financial crisis in 2007 through 2009, and is a culmination of years of collaboration between different regulatory teams, research teams. The BIS and IOSCO were actually the co-authors of this. They're the leading, or the BIS is the central bank as it were, and IOSCO is basically the SEC's daddy, as it were. It's not quite, but these are the international organizations that kind of oversee and work with setting standards for securities and for central banking. And Principle 9, I've mentioned this in several different documents and presentations. I'm sorry if I sound like repetitive, but the idea here is in following the financial crisis in 2009, 2008, 2007, that time period, the idea here is let's get away from relying on commercial bank money. There's the credit risk, there's liquidity risk. Let's, if we can, all FMIs possible, try to use central bank cash or money, or however you want to use the term here. In this case, try to use money and try to reduce or minimize the interactions with commercial bank, and that's because of credit risk. We saw banks going under. I have a chart here from the FDIC in a moment. And so what you end up having is, I would argue, fragility on fragility. So you have fragile commercial banks, relatively speaking. These too big to fail institutions, SIFIs, whatever term you want to use, they still exist today. That hasn't gone away. In fact, we have higher concentration risk today in 2021 than we did in 2007, 2008. That time period, because of all the consolidation that's been taking place. Now, there's been a lot of capital buffers and requirements implemented by the requirements from the Dodd-Frank Act that supposedly help out during stressful periods of times, potential crises that will mitigate types of systemic fragility. But bottom line is, if you look at every single collateral-backed stablecoin, they ultimately sit on top of the commercial bank system in the U.S. And there's ways to remedy that have been proposed, mostly in like blog posts or Twitter feeds. It's not like serious legislation. In the meantime, there are other proposals, such as central bank digital account, central bank digital currency, neither of which, by the way, need a blockchain whatsoever. In fact, narrow banks and Fed accounts are completely agnostic to how they're implemented. So I know a lot of viewers probably are like, hey, how does this tie into your favorite cryptocurrency bag? It doesn't. That's not what the utility is about. But we're going to put all that aside. This is not a conversation about CBDCs. Happy to again talk about that later on. Another kind of, you can say, plank in this larger corpus of issues is if you look at the transaction volume of stable coins, last year on-chain volume on Ethereum and a couple other chains, just over $1 trillion of these quote-unquote stable coins, and that has accelerated throughout this year, and probably will be double or triple that by the end of the year, assuming there isn't a huge bear market. And that doesn't include the off-chain transactions through centralized exchanges whatsoever. Now, people that promote these will say this is amazing utility that's being provided to the market. I mean, look, there's a lot of reasons why stable coins are used in daily use. We don't have to go through all those, but ultimately, the reason why various large governments are trying to crack down or at least have better optics into this is because you don't have per transaction on-chain surveillance. You have the ability to do chain analytics afterwards through vendors like Chainalysis or Elliptic. You can try to do it in real time. They do. They both offer like quote unquote real time validation, but you still don't know who those participants are on chain. And so there's been efforts to try and de-anonymize wallets. There's been threshold rules. I'm not here to push a specific policy, but I'm saying, well, there's a reason why there's a motivation to put these different limits on there. It's because they want to prevent, for example, the financing of terrorism or money laundering. And so no conversation on stablecoins can go away from this idea of a shadow bank. So the argument here is a stablecoin issuer is actual shadow bank, and the tokens that they create and they put into production would be shadow money. And the idea behind a shadow bank isn't brand new. This isn't something that started in 2014 with the creation of Realcoin or Tether. This predates even the financial crisis. But it became front and center during that particular crisis because of these non-bank entities that people were having exposure to that ultimately failed and had to be. I'm not endorsing this, but they eventually got bailed out. And that's not just in the U.S. If you look in China, so I worked in China for about 5 years, and right as I was leaving in 2013, it's called these alternative wealth management products were kind of the talk of the town. I had some friends that were coming up to me saying, I'm getting 10, 12, 14% APY on these products on these P2P lending platforms. This is the way, finance will be in the future. You don't need to put money in banks. And, I'm not endorsing the status quo whatsoever, but what was happening is these shadow banks, as they were, these P2P lenders, were taking the customer deposits and putting them into these other shadow banks. And so basically everyone's doing hypothecating, they're doing they're not disclosing in any of these types of activities to their customers. And when they reach the top, as it were, there's always tops of these things. It blew up, and the only recourse these victims had were to storm corporate offices. There's plenty of stories. In fact, the world's largest documented Ponzi's took place over the last few years in China. Now they're trying to de-lever and de-risk that entire process. One estimate from S&P found that it's about $13 trillion was locked up in these types of, as an aggregate, these shadow banks. That's not to say that they're all, horrible organizations. There's just no accountability. There's very limited accountability and surveillance into what these organizations are doing. And as we've seen repeatedly, organizations that aren't interested in being held to consumer protection or investor protection standards, they go a mile, as it were. They take it to the limit and or they blow up. It happens. There's actually no instance in which that doesn't happen so far. So rather than go on the soapbox related to China, let's move on to the Fed itself. So this is a screenshot from the Federal Reserve Board's website talking about, from a policy standpoint, you have all these FMIs, these financial market infrastructures here in the U.S. that interact with foreign FMIs, and you have foreign banks and other institutions that interact with the domestic institutions. So from a policy standpoint, they want to make sure that they have optics into the risks that these other external organizations can pose to the financial system here. And so in theory, you think that they would be interested in obtaining information about offshore entities that are trying to use US-linked bank accounts or e-bank notes, as some people may describe a stablecoin. And true enough, they are. There's teams of researchers primarily just doing research to see what's going on that maybe they don't classify as systemic. But from a FSB standpoint, this is not new necessarily. The whole idea of shadow banking, as I said, predates all of this by decades. So we could speculate on if and when they'll comment publicly about any of this stuff. But I will say that on the organizations that kind of brand or market themselves as bankless, it doesn't happen. There's no bankless exchange per se. Everyone's reliant. These cryptocurrency exchanges or even these DeFi protocols that do lending are highly dependent on liquid access to stable coins, which again are linked back to some U.S. bank and specifically, deposits therein. So you have this umbilical cord. I call them parasitic because it's very much a one-way relationship. But, and again, I'm not saying DeFi. I want to back up and say, I'm not saying DeFi itself is bad or anything like that. I play around with all that stuff for clients and friends on a daily basis. So I'm certainly interested in that from an intellectual standpoint. But if one comment I get a lot, or one question I get a lot is, Tim, why doesn't the government do this or that? Like, there's actually plenty of, I'm not saying plenty, there's already existing laws on the book that just aren't being enforced. For example, deposit taking. There's already stuff on the books about why or how those types of entities should be structured. So I'm not saying Aave will have to register as a bank, but they did announce back in May. One of the founders mentioned on social media that they have an AML screening pool for institutions. So basically, they have multiple different assets, multiple different ways to get some yield as a lender. And now apparently they're going to allow institutions to go through, like they'll basically screen the coins through, I guess, Chainalysis or something like that to see the provenance of that if it hits a sanctioned individual or sanctioned address. We don't have to spend too much money on comments on the shadow money. I only have this here so that way people know that there's a difference and that Federal Reserve personnel are aware of that. There's for whatever reason on social media, like, oh, the Fed is stupid or whatever. I'm not here to defend the status quo. Again, I'm just saying that I'm almost certain that the key people at that organization aren't not only not stupid, but are not. This is not the first rodeo. This is not the first time that they've seen these types of instruments being used in a different way that people think are creative. So the closest facsimile, I think, when you talk to ex or current regulators is the equivalent of something like a money market fund for stablecoin. So if those of you who haven't bothered to put money into something like a CD, a certificate of deposit, it's a very low yield instrument. But what basically ends up happening is you give these potential organizations your capital, deposits, and they'll give you some yield. That yield comes from them going to the market and finding something like a 1 or 10, or there's different length duration of notes or treasuries that or treasury bonds that they'll get. But the point here is in 2008, 2009, some of these blew up basically. They broke the buck, as it were. They're no longer trading at par, and we see that happen all the time, obviously, with cryptocurrencies, or at least the stable coins. But despite the oversight and regulation and efforts to manage that, you still had it blow up again in March 2020. And that's not to say the regulations are bad. It just shows you just like it's that market is not architect, like these people running it as well-intentioned as they may be, still screwed up or still couldn't withstand a massive crisis like there was 15 months ago. And so when I hear, like, I'm in a bunch of chat rooms and people are like, it can't happen in the cryptocurrency world. If it does, it's not gonna be that big of a deal. Like, it happened, like it breaks a buck all the time. But obviously there's within a certain band. Is it 1%? Is it 2%? Like 5 weeks ago in late May when the bigger price action took place, you had a variety of these stable coins, especially on the algorithmic side, that dropped more than 5%. So I'm not saying I know what will happen, but if we're going to be intellectually honest about this and talk about the ethos of the cryptocurrency world, should they be bailed out? Absolutely not. If this blows up, we could argue about the merits of doing that or not later on. But if this whole experiment's supposed to be anarchic, you can't have your cake and eat it too, if we're trying to be intellectually honest. So what does this have to do with the parasitic stablecoins? So I've talked about this. I had a long article / paper in January that describes most of this. And what I'm going to talk about here is the credit risk of both the stablecoin issuer and the commercial bank. So before I do that, though, here's that diagram I showed, or I mentioned earlier. This is basically the past 20 years of bank failures here in the U.S. And you could see, 2007 to 2009, 2010, those were basically the key years in which basically these banks blew up because of all the reasons we've discussed, or people have discussed about the financial crisis. And so far, there hasn't been here in the U.S. So with credit credit risk here, in the US right now, if you opened up a bank account, you as a deposit holder or account holder, you have a single level of credit risk. That's with the bank itself. If they go bankrupt or they're unable to meet liabilities or something like that. In most developed countries and in many developing countries, you have schemes for deposit insurance who then step in if that blows up. And during the financial crisis, the FDIC went in and cleaned up every single one of those. So right now, despite the fact that you may have some commercial banks with impeccable credit rating in the market, they're ultimately not the lender of last resort. And so if there is a systemic crisis or a major liquidity crisis, they're still going to be dependent on like the Federal Reserve from stepping in. So that's one. So the stablecoins actually introduce another one, and that's the stablecoin issuer itself. And that's manifold. Basically, what could happen is maybe the issuer, for whatever reason, defaults or goes bankrupt or they get sued. Like, for example, the New York AG, maybe that's that case, while it may have ended in that jurisdiction, it takes on a new life in some national or international body who then hold them accountable for the lies that the executives have made over the years. Or maybe not. Maybe that doesn't ever happen. But ultimately, the stablecoin issuer is a credit risk, and so is the instruments that they themselves invest in. So, for example, Tether is the 7th largest holder of commercial paper in the U.S., at least, if not globally. And we didn't find this out until the New York Attorney General sued them and asked them for, as part of the settlement agreement, that they have to provide a quarterly audit. And they provided figures. Maybe they're wrong or not. That's not part of this discussion here. But we don't know who the commercial paper was issued by or any of that stuff. So we have when banks, actual regulated banks, provide those types of numbers, they have breakdown into the grade of what these types of bonds or whatever the instrument is, what it's rated, and we don't have some of those details. Now, I believe the general counsel tweets or has their own blog post about these things informally, but the point is there's a credit risk for each of those types of organizations that you invested in too. So again, that's not new. I'm not saying that that's a brand new thing that's been brought into this world, but that's just an additional risk that deposit holders of stablecoins may not be aware of, and they should be, because nothing is guaranteed unless. But I suspect that most of these people think they're going to be bailed out explicitly or implicitly by the Fed. And the last thing I say triple layer. The other one, we don't have time to go into this, is just the possibility of a fork, and depending on the chain, is it run by a singular organization, a singular foundation? Most of these stablecoins are issued on just a handful of chains right now, but as they percolate, there's that chance that you have the risk of a single project or maintainer, administrator of the chain, as it were. So I call this whole process, this whole thing, a dependency stack. You've seen plenty of cryptocurrency or DeFi stacks. This is my kind of like shade at that. So ignoring the L1 itself, this is exogenous to the blockchain that you're using. At the very bottom, you have the Federal Reserve, and they have a couple key roles here. Number one, they provide a stable unit of account that everyone measures their wealth in, prices everything in. And then they also provide the actual rails, the infrastructure that is called FedWire, to every single one of these, not every single bank. There's banks that actually use them as a correspondent, as it were, if you're a small, like little community credit union. Commercial banks on top of that rely on FedWire and a resilient financial system that's managed and supervised. And on top of the commercial banks, you have the collateral-backed stablecoin issuers. Remember, they custody their coins at the commercial banks. And then you have these DeFi apps, primarily the AMMs and the lending protocols that have the bulk of the TVL is these stablecoins. So again, everything I argue here is dependent on a well-managed, secure central bank. And so obviously it depends on country to country. So right now everyone's just kind of riding on the coattails or free riding off of the Federal Reserve. And so we can see some growth. This is a couple charts here. So right here, you can see kind of a leveling off. This is a couple days ago, leveling off around 105 billion. Again, this is assuming that there's actually deposits in the bank. I'm not here to argue whether there are or not, but assuming that there are, and this is specifically Tether's supply. Again, it's about 60, just over 60 billion, because they've issued about half of it on Tron and half of it on Ethereum, and they've also started issuing it on a couple other chains too. But if we actually drill down into some of the DeFi apps real quick, so as of yesterday or so, there's about 12 billion TVL on Aave, and 5 out of the 6 top markets on Aave are some kind of USD denominated stablecoin. And let's see, next screenshot. This is from Compound, another lending platform. So as you can see here, basically 3 out of 5 of the top markets are also stablecoins. And so I did the math here for you guys. So together, and they coincidentally have about 60% of deposits on each of these platforms are stablecoins of some kind. And if you do the DAI scenario, and I should update this just a little bit more. This is from this morning. Basically 59%, let me go back to that chart, 59% of the collateral backing DAI is USDC. In fact, just over 12% of all USDC that's ever been issued is actually locked in DAI, which is about $3 billion. And so again, that money maybe it does just pop out of thin air, but ultimately that's all deposited somewhere in a custody bank in the US. So everyone, again, is dependent on these banking relationships in the Fed. So we could talk about why that number went up. Again, when a week ago I tweeted it was like 52%, and so it's grown 7%, up to 7% in the past week. And part of that's because of the decline in price of ETH in Bitcoin. So those vaults get closed out, and there's ways to move up and down in terms of arbitraging the price. We're not here to talk that technical, but my point is there's reasons for why it's above 50% right now. And this is just to give you guys some perspective, this is an AMM. This is the most popular AMM in the market, called Uniswap. If you go look at their liquidity pools, this is as of last night. If you click each one of them, you could actually find out in the trading pairs how much of what is being deposited. So I did the math. It's at 340. So it's right here, middle of the screen. $340 million of stable coins in the top 10 Uniswap pairs, and that's just one AMM, and that's just the top 10 of that. Again, there's Sushi Swap and some others. So if you looked at DeFi Pulse, which is probably the best aggregator out there, it's just over 50 billion of TVL. At least a third is stable coins. So it's like $16 billion or so stable coins in lending protocols, just a couple lending protocols. And you add on the AMM. So like, I'm not saying half of all TVL is stable coins, but it's probably getting close to that, which again shows what I'm saying. It's hyper dependent, or at least very dependent on the DeFi is very dependent on effectively US banks, and this doesn't even include other DeFi chains or whatever, these other supposed decentralized chains like BSC, although it's just run by one organization right now. So Venus is a competitor to Aave, and they have about 500 million in a couple different stablecoins. So why is this? If you could see from these empirical data points, as it were, this trend towards greater dependency on U.S. banking access, why is this not front and center? Why are people not talking about this? And my argument is it's the NGU cult. Number go up, and that's basically become a religion. Like anything that does not help the number go up is bad. It's FUD. And so there's growth at any cost. And we've seen this repeatedly. And so it's funny when I'm in chat rooms, again, well-intentioned people, but like when you hear them say, let's just let the free market reign. Well, we've seen that happen repeatedly. With the end result is lots of victims, and it's privatized losses and socialized gains. Privatized gains and socialized losses. And that's if a systemic issue hits here, and that's likely to happen again. So we don't have. If Tether truly has that much commercial paper and is providing this type of functions to the market, why don't we have people with their little brimmed hats come in and actually monitor them like we do typical banks with actual physical supervisors there? Again, I'm not on the fast dial to Jay Powell telling them these things. I'm just saying, like, if we treat everyone evenly, even Steven world, why don't we have that take place? So to me, again, I know we're kind of running over on time here, but I feel this is like the current moment in 2021 feels a lot like it was 4 or 5 years ago, when during conversations with, I used to work at R3, and they also had a consortium of banks. And each of the banks basically had a team at one point in 2015, 2016 that had made their own internal, bank coin or whatever. And they're like, yeah, we could tokenize the commercial, the bank deposits, and we could put it out on a chain. And that was all scuppered. Like, this didn't move forward with those for a variety of reasons. The three here are, and these are not the only three, but number one, you have amplification of systemic risk. Remember, these are too big to fail institutions, supposedly. They're SIFIs, systemically important financial institutions. And so if there are building new products that are expected to have that much more volume on it, well, then you're just amplifying that concentration risk. The idea of having surveillance for CFT purposes was like a no-go. Again, I'm not saying that that banks won't ever go through with this in 2021, but at the time, there was this, you could do on-chain analytics. Of course, you can do that right now. That doesn't prevent that activity from taking place. You can only do stuff after the fact. And then it's just simply not aligned with the PFMIs, what people actually cared about then. Maybe they don't care about as much today. I haven't taken a survey on that, but yeah, that was very influential at the time. So why has it been allowed to grow to this size? And I would argue that globally, the financial regulators they're very understaffed or under-resourced, and they're just bombarded nonstop by very vocal coin promoters and coin lobbyists. We see this right now happening in Central America, probably to the detriment of the local people. This $150 million fund that El Salvador is setting up is really just going to benefit the political elite, the well-connected. And we have a whole conversation about why this is why their little volcano money is really not a great idea for the bulk of society, but we're not here to get on that soapbox. My point is you're going to have that type of coin lobbying take place up and down that coast and in small islands. Basically, all these marginalized countries are going to be hit up by the same kind of people. And if you don't have a well-staffed, well-educated workforce internally, you could be won over, as it were, to pump somebody's bags. So I have an appendix here. I'm not going to go through, but I had some examples on people on social media doing just that. So this is basically the last slide. It's a lot for concluding remarks. I will say that there are some people who have thought through some of the ways to get around these technical problems. So Rye, for example, is trying to get back to the root of DAI, which is to basically go back to a single asset that's not pegged to US dollars. UST is fairly decentralized, but as a result, they also wiggle from the peg quite a bit. And Frax, it actually has withstood the most for all the algorithmic ones, but again, it's collateralized in USDC. Another remark, one of the guys who reviewed this document, he used to work at a central bank, and he's like, Tim, definitely tell people there should be no external bailouts. If the industry itself wants to bail itself out, have at it, but they shouldn't expect effectively taxpayers to come in and bail out these stablecoin issuers or any of these shadow money instruments that may exist because of moral hazard. So you could argue with me if you want. Happy to introduce you to the guy who suggested I put that in there. Ultimately, though, I think all this points to the fact that you have a contradiction taking place, which is you have this marketing of it's something that's very decentralized, that's non-custodial, this DeFi, as it were. But in practice, it's heavily reliant on centralized collateral through traditional intermediaries, specifically central banks. So as I pointed out, probably up to maybe half of all collateral that's TVL right now is some form of stablecoin. And again, those live on top of commercial banks, which will live on top of a central bank. And for legal and regulatory reasons, I actually have been saying this for years. Don't market your thing as being a US dollar equivalent, because what ends up happening is you have something called the BSA in the US, and the long arm of FinCEN could rope you into it. I'm not saying they will. Maybe they're understaffed and they won't do it. But it'd be great if the DeFi world somehow created their own unit of account and they cared about it enough to price everything in that. And I don't mean sats. That's stupid. Like, we could talk about some actual some algorithmic stability that has nothing to do with limited supply. And then we could talk about other characteristics in credit risk. But I will stop there. If anyone wants to contact me, here's my email and the Twitter account. So any questions so far?
So yeah, thanks, Tim, for this really fascinating talk. It was a lot of fun. And to me, actually, I had never really looked into the numbers like you did. And I guess that's why you're of numbers on Twitter. But yeah, really, it's quite fascinating that so much of the DeFi space is really based on not even central bank money, but rather commercial bank money. So that if there's a banking crisis, it would affect even us here in DeFi land. And that's it's quite fascinating, and it has a lot of implications, I think, as well. It also has implications that so much of our value is in the USD as unit of account. So that's really why I do think that, yeah, we do need another like basket of goods style unit of account. Those who know me personally know that I'm a big fan of the Unidad de Fomento in Chile, and but there's still like a geopolitical risk because it's local to the Chilean context. But having like a decentralized basket of goods that's verifiable and on-chain, to me, sounds like it would make a lot of sense. Have you ever seen anyone try to accomplish this, Tim?
Yeah, there's a group called Benchmark, MARK. Again, not an endorsement, but they launched a synthetic SDR a few months ago. I think they launched it on Avalanche, or maybe they launched it on Ethereum. I'd have to double check. But unfortunately for them, it hasn't managed real well on the peg, and that's because of just a variety of reasons. Number one, it's not very liquid relative to, say, Frax. But no, the short answer is no. There's been a lot of proposals, but implementations, I haven't seen many.
Yeah, SDR is one easy candidate to implement because you can get an oracle for the value. You don't have to maintain a basket of goods, which can be a bit more harder to coordinate in a decentralized context. But you still have quite a lot of fiat risk, but it is distributed. So yeah, maybe SDR is interesting. I'm surprised more people haven't looked at SDR in the DeFi space. Yeah, the dollar is just so popular, right? It's really quite amazing. And you in the SORA ecosystem, we're focusing, and I mentioned this briefly on my talk on a DAI pegged coin or a synthetic asset, and I think that's just a first step, but it's definitely not a long-term solution because you really need to be pegged to fundamental value, which would be linked to purchasing power, right? So that's something that I think needs a lot of work in this space.
Sure, and then that raises the question of like who's purchasing power, because if this thing's supposed to circulate globally, like global conditions, there's economic conditions are different in each region, state, country. So trying to rebase that would be difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just
yeah, it takes some creativity, I think. So you can look at purchasing power parity or other types of metrics, but you basically would have to average, right? And so you have the Goldilocks problem where some places would be just right, but then it wouldn't be applicable for some areas potentially. But yeah, I mean, it is what it is, right? But it is better potentially than using. I mean, even if you use SDR, it's still kind of localized to just a few countries. But yeah, I think that's it's quite fascinating. I want to kind of get your thought on what you really think the future of DeFi is, given that regulation is coming. I mean, it's very clear. Do you think that things like Chainalysis and Elliptic are going to be good enough to satisfy the regulatory needs? And if not, can we at least meet the societal needs? Because human society has a need to prevent financial crime or prevent illegal criminal activity, because that hurts all of us. So can we find like some solution that would work in a decentralized context?
Yeah, I'm pretty skeptical at this stage. I used to be an advisor to Blockseer. It was an analytics company, and they got acquired a couple of years ago. In hearing their experiences and talking to some former employees of Elliptic, it sounds like really to do any good, as it were, you still need feet on the ground. You still have to have physical presence, physical agents to bust into home, the bad guy's place. So you could. It kind of annoys me when I see these people on talking about ransomware, like, oh, it's stupid to do ransomware. You get traced. Yeah, but that doesn't, just because you could trace it doesn't mean you could go, get any kind of recourse. If you look at the financial crime, as you mentioned, related to just to ransomware, like these hospitals, my mom works at a hospital that was hit by some ransomware a couple years ago. My brother's a firefighter, and the little city he works for was hit by ransomware, and they paid. They shouldn't have, but they did, and they're not going to get that money back, even if they trace it. Like, tracing is just one step. You ultimately need to have, in order to find the people, you need to have someone that knows how to triangulate, say node propagation or something like that. But that doesn't necessarily even work. People can use Tor or something like that. So the ways to bust it's just old-fashioned police work, and so you need physical agents doing that type of hard work. And so it's not very scalable in the sense that you can't go hire tens of thousands of agents to go fight against all the bad guys at one time. I suppose, unless it's like a gigantic war or something. That's weird edge cases. That obviously is not going to happen. So the Overton window, as it were, is unfortunately probably going to have to live with this horrible blight. And so I'm skeptical that there's a quote unquote decentralized solution to something like ransomware.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, there was a proposal in our Telegram chats that the SORA Parliament should have like a decentralized police force with like some rifles and go like kind of bust in the doors of ransomware. Or we have a lot of scammers who pretend to be admins and they steal keys of users. So I think capital punishment's good for people like that, but. That's another topic, I guess. Getting back to DeFi and systemic risks, so a lot of people in crypto, talk a lot about Bitcoin being as a hedge against the US dollar and all these things, which is kind of silly because as US financial markets go down, Bitcoin also goes down. But let's pretend we don't look at the numbers and go with the narrative, because if the dollar were to collapse, like so much of the DeFi infrastructure would also lose so much of its value. Do you think that like this kind of anti-correlated narrative like holds any water at all?
I guess the way I look at cryptocurrency in terms of trading and price action, I just think of it as a highly leveraged equity ETF. So something like in the US, we have QQQ, which is a tech ETF. You have triple QQQ, which is the 3x one. So I kind of look at something like any of these coins to be significantly larger in terms of the volatility up or down. So I'm not a trader, or at least I'm not an active trader. So I'd be happy to pontificate about it's stuff in theory, but yeah, I'm not convinced that there's We've seen this in practice, especially the last 6 months. I'm not convinced that there's going to be a decoupling between those two.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the people in the chat wrote, like, out of all the different kind of stable coins that you see, like, which ones do you think are less risky? Like, DAI at least has some non-USDC assets in it. And I know you mentioned Terra and some other really fascinating projects as well. Like, are there any that you think, maybe if you don't recommend them, but rather like at least have interesting points to their design? And what are those?
So I'm trying to remember a tweet from Vitalik from like a year ago. He's like, let's take DAI and strip out the governance and allow anyone to post collateral and build out that kind of project. So that way you're not stuck with this governance centralization issue. I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but ultimately, if anyone could use any kind of collateral, you end up with this problem with the AMMs have. So like Uniswap, it's like 50 to 60 new tokens added to it every day, according to an interview with Hayden Adams a few weeks ago. And so you have, hundreds, if not thousands of tokens. Some of them are purposely scammy. Some of them are completely illiquid. So if anyone adds anything to DAI as in terms of collateral, remember it used to be ETH, and then they about just under 2 years ago they added this whole multi-collateral process. Like I don't even know how that mechanically would work. So I'm sure someone else has thought of that, but I don't think the liquidity function itself would allow for that, because you'd have to over collateralize stuff again, which is what they were trying to get away from. I think it's the same problem for any of these other synthetic assets that are trying to track something that's exogenous to itself, right? Is you have to basically over collateralize to keep it in line with that peg. So I know that DAI has tried to solve some of this through a kludge called the PSM. It's a stability mechanism. So basically, the bigger green portion here of USDC, there's two here, but there's the bigger one is just like 2.5 billion, maybe slightly less than that, of USDC sitting in this stability mechanism. So it's just their way of like, no matter what, we have this stability, this backstop, and again, that backstop isn't USDC, it's the Fed, because without an orderly financial system and a stable unit of account, you won't have this is these knock-on effects and stuff like that. So like I was describing earlier. So no, I think DAI was interesting initially, and I don't hate DAI right now. You can't blacklist it per se. So maybe in terms of censorship resistance, maybe that's one of the few utilities it has relative to say USDC itself. So Circle, or Center rather, is the organization that manages that, and they frequently update like which addresses are blacklisted. And Tether, that organization, does the same thing for Tether. Or Tether Limited does the same thing for USDT. So I guess one of the remaining pieces of utility it has is it's not censorable at this stage. Although Maker's team itself, I believe Dev Shop and the investors were primarily in California, in the Bay Area. Although I think they're registered in Europe somewhere, or at least they were. Denmark, okay. And so the other algorithm. So remember, you basically have two categories of stable coins. You have the collateral backed ones, which we just talked about, and then you have these pure algorithmic ones, or at least ones that are trying to be algorithmic, in which no person manually does anything. There's no intervention. There's no supposed centralization after you kickstart the protocol on the chain. And so Frax is an example of this. They started out fully collateralized. I mean, Frax stands for, the idea is to be fractionally reserved, or under capital efficient, or under, like, instead of being over collateralized, you're under collateralized. So it started out at 100% and it's drifted down. I don't know what it is today. I think it got down to like 70% at one point, and it was still able to manage to hold its peg despite the volatility in the market. But again, it's the collateral is USDC. So, and that's not to throw shade at Sam and his team. I think highly of what they do over there, and I'm glad that they're trying to experiment on that. So Rye, I'm not sure what their roadmap is per se, but they're trying to go back to the roots of what DAI was, not be pegged to any particular, not accept collateral like USDC. And so in UST, again, JP Conning, if you guys are looking for someone who's very smart, who's thought through a lot of these things, follow him on Twitter. It's JP_Conning. He used to work at a couple different banks on the credit risk side, I believe, or interest rate analysis. I forget which department, but he's been thinking deeply about interest rate policies for years. He actually is the one who coined the term FedCoin originally, almost just over 7 years ago. He's been in the thick of the whole CBDC discussion, but he frequently writes about algorithmic stablecoins, and he talked about new bits blowing up and BitUSD. So these things have come and gone. And he was pointing out Terra UST was great up until the crisis, and then it wobbled quite a bit. So he has this theory that the more something is decentralized, in the sense that there's no collateral, there's no centralized collateral, there's no human intervention, the more likely it is to wobble away from the peg. And vice versa. On the other side of the spectrum, the more centralized it is, and the more types of centralized collateral it accepts, or human intervention, the more stable it is. So clearly, if the ethos is to be decentralized, as the name DeFi suggests, and non-custodial, then the should be the goal in my mind to go towards the latter, or the former, towards the building out more experiments on what UST is trying, or Frax. not an endorsement of those projects. I'm just trying to answer that question in terms of who's doing that. And there could be many others. I certainly don't want to say that those are the only ones involved. And I've even mentioned Benchmark earlier. So maybe in a few months we could follow up to see if others have launched. I do think that there is more room for experiments for creating unit of accounts that are not reliant on exogenous value like the US dollar. So, and I've seen that with your guys' project of XST. So I'm pretty excited to see where you guys take that, because you've been trying to think that way for as long as I've known you.
Yeah, it's been many years coming. Yeah, so it'll be really interesting to see what happens. I think one of the secrets that's not really talked a lot about maintaining the pegs is it's not just about collateral, it's about market making activities too. And I think Tether was as successful as it has been because they were really, really aggressive in that space from early on. So if something like DAI, for example, or UST or anything else wants to be successful, they have to kind of go out and play all the markets and have lots of reserves. There's no way around it. Regarding, just maybe one last question, regarding El Salvador, I just wanted, since we're talking a lot about El Salvador today with the various speakers, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on like how this experiment will go, and is there any way to salvage this so they don't destroy their country?
So for what's worth, I don't think I've ever tweeted or said that the countries can be destroyed. I just feel that these guys are being taken for a ride, like the normal people who don't have access. Like, if the goal is to empower people that are underbanked or unbanked or financial inclusion, whatever. Like, by the way, I don't like the people playing on those heartstrings, because I find it's mostly self-serving and unethical. I saw a lot of that when I was in the Bay Area with these little fintechs trying to, save the poor, downtrodden third world country people. So I feel that there's a lot of those same cliches taking place here. But putting all those aside for the moment, if you truly are trying to just bring a safe, secure, inexpensive way of transfer of value in that particular country, El Salvador's central bank runs an RTGS. They could simply open it up, just like we're proposing here with Fed accounts or what they're doing in the Bank of England, and allow people to, retail users, non-banks, to have access to the RTGS. Now, the front end, the way that's handled can be done through existing entities. There's proposals here in the US to do it through nonprofits, through public banks, through the post office even. Not saying I know the right way, but there's infrastructure here in the US could do that. I'm not saying for sure, there's similar infrastructure in El Salvador. I'm not at all saying I'm expert on that. I'm just saying that if the idea of, the general idea is to provide safe, secure, cheap, inexpensive, fast transactions, you don't need to use a cryptocurrency whatsoever. You don't need to use a blockchain. Certainly don't need to use private channels on some guy's Lightning implementation like Strike is doing. It's all self-serving. All these guys have a bunch of coins that they want to go up in value, and they think this is a great marketing gimmick. And it is. It's been great for them. It's gotten lots of free PR at the expense of the people who actually bear the brunt of this, which is going to be the average merchant who's apparently forced. Like, according to Article 7, you're required to, if possible, unless you're exempted, to convert during commercial processes. And that's BS. That's a total contradiction to the ethos in 2009, which was to allow free markets, free trade. Again, I'm not even an ANCAP. I'm opposed to that ideology. But my point is if you're calling yourself that, it's hypocritical to say you're allow people to have free ability to transfer in commerce, but then you impose specific type of legal tender. So for what it's worth, we could talk about legal tender laws in the U.S. Like, most commercial transactions in the U.S., for example, aren't done in the legal tender. It's done in things like bank deposits. That's not legal tender. It's not as defined in the legal tender law. So again, happy to go on and on about El Salvador, but ultimately I think that it's a disservice to people if you're trying to bring in a proprietary or semi-proprietary solution to a problem that could already be solved with existing infrastructure.
Yeah, hopefully it's more of a marketing gimmick than other things. But I think that countries like El Salvador could, of course, benefit from the use of SORA. That also has a decentralized governance mechanism than just something like Bitcoin, where basically new money is only given to miners, which is not maybe not the most socially equitable outcome. So sorry for keeping you so late. Thanks a lot for your time. And I think this has been really an exciting talk, and it's a great way to close out today's conference. So
thanks for having me, Dakota. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tim. Today has been a really exciting and interesting day. It's been a long conference. We've been live streaming for more than 8 hours now. It's been quite quite exhausting, and we've had our fair share of technical difficulties during the day. But fortunately, these worked out. We had wonderful talks from all of our scheduled speakers, including Professor Werner, who really was quite fascinating, and Tyrell Bursch's, whose unique insights into politics, I think, gave us really a lot of hints at what we can do in SORA in designing our ecosystem. Really, SORA is about engineering a decentralized economic system. So rather than only having theory or only talking about doing things, we actually try to do things. And this means, of course, making mistakes. It means taking corrective action and doing things and working together as a community. But hopefully this can contribute a lot to our understanding of economics and our understanding of social structures. And this can push humanity forward. As we move into the age of Aquarius and individuals are empowered more, we must focus into creating the right social structures to support this. So with that, I'll close out the day. We're going to start networking now. Please feel free to connect randomly to other participants for 3 minutes at a time. You can just go to the networking tab on the side of your screen. And thanks a lot for joining us every day. And also thank you to our sponsors, one of which is my company, SORMITSU. There's Koso, which is a really exciting prebiotic drink and cleansed drink from Japan. And of course, Noir, which is the most refined and sparkling canned bubbly in the world. So thank you for your time today, and please have fun talking to everyone. Bye for now.